what I hope people will get from this discussion is that a topic that probably most people thought they had no interest in turns out to have 1,000 fascinating, and even if you're not fascinated by them, important facets, right?
Right.
Right? Fire suppression is not a small matter here in the West. This is a serious issue that we deal with. The smoke that comes off these fires, even when the fires are remote, the degradation in the quality of life, as a result of a failure to understand equilibria with respect to the natural process of fire that, removes the fuel at a particular rate, where, we had, 100 years of fire suppression that resulted in a huge buildup of fuel so that when the fires burn, they decimate the landscape, yep. Right? Mm-hmm. That's a failure to understand equilibria. And what I learned from you is that actually beavers are also an important factor in suppressing fire by adjusting the way water flows through these ecosystems. So, are you interested in fire suppression in the West? Well, if you live in the West, you better be. Right? Because you're going to be breathing the consequences otherwise, or driven out of your home or whatever. Yep. So anything more to say about beavers and fire?
I had the experience of responding. So I volunteer with search and rescue, and I responded to a fire, I guess it's 2 years ago now, that burnt 2 of the nearby towns down, more or less, Phoenix and Talent. And there's a greenway that connects all of these towns in the Rogue Valley. A really great thing, right? Somebody said, hey, we want a greenway. Let's buffer the creek. Let's give it a lot of room. Let's put a bike path in.
Yeah, I believe I've ridden repeatedly down there when Heather got me a bike building course in
Ashland.
In
They're
Ashland.
famous for that. Yes,
yep.
DarkHorse.
I used to ride that greenway all the time.
Yeah.
Before the fire.
So
go ahead. What happened?
Yeah, so we had some intense winds, and somebody started a little fire that became a big fire. That greenway, which to our human perspective looked like verdant, healthy habitat, acted like a wick, and it drew fire through 2 cities.
Wow.
And we imagine fire coming in from the hills and
right.
Time to escape this way, but no, it never even went into the hills. It drew fire through these cities because the stream had collapsed down into a ditch. The water was unavailable. It was down there, right? And people got used to that. It's like a creek. It's something you look down on, right? And even in that context where we had a really wide space where people hadn't actually built close to it, the fact that the creek was collapsed meant that plants that could take advantage of this novel niche, like blackberry, had fully colonized this entire riparian area, right? If there was water that was all over the place and it was this messy, braided, marshy thing, blackberry don't do well in that, right? And the native plants that we're lamenting the loss of would be doing excellently well because that's what they are used to, right? But instead of having a fire buffer, instead of having something that wouldn't burn, we had something that was extremely explosive when it came to a spark.
Right, it was productive with exactly the wrong stuff.
Exactly the wrong stuff. Yeah, and so, I remember standing at a roadblock that I was helping to maintain at that point near the creek, and you could just hear people's propane tanks exploding, and the valley was glowing, and 2 towns burning down puts off a lot of light. And yeah, looking at the creek and just realizing, wow, this is what we've wrought. By allowing these systems to collapse out, to allowing that soil to dry up, these novel niches where then we get this dense vegetation, it has consequences.
Has huge consequences.
And so the reverse is true too with beavers and fire, where you have a system where beavers are maintaining a landscape that's wetted. You see wildlife run to that when there's a fire. A lot of folks that work cattle will see their cattle go to the beaver wetlands when there's a fire on the east side, of Oregon.
So there've got to be 2 reasons for that, I would guess. One, the activity of the beaver is fire suppressive in nature. But 2, the choice of beavers to alter a particular piece of habitat may be responsive to it being resilient to fire, because remember the other ecosystem engineer that's been operating the same timeline. People were
burning.
We're making use of fire. Yeah.
Right. So there was a boundary between the two ecosystem engineers that had to be maintained.
And you can imagine, let's say that you had a beaver that was naive about fire.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very good at engineering, and it modified some habitat that was particularly prone to fire. Then the point is, well, that's a short-term project too, right? Because to the extent that the beaver is dependent on, trees in the riparian zone surviving, then the point is it made an error.
Yeah.
Right? Building in a place that had an Achilles heel. So anyway, yeah, you could see both of those processes at work, and you could see augmentation, right? Whereas again, in the West, we have a plague of eucalyptus trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
I presume beavers do not utilize eucalyptus.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah.
Although they will go after incense cedar, which has a pretty pungent. It does seem to be rare though, and they seem to mostly use it for building things with and not eating it.
Yeah, building with cedar makes sense.
Yeah, especially in an aquatic setting, right? We
right.
do that too.
Totally. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is too, in the context of fire, if you have a degraded system that doesn't have beavers, maybe it's super incised, and so they can't. Every time they try to build a dam, it can't persist because the velocity is just too much. It's like a bowling alley of water every winter, and it blows beaver dams out, which is the case with Bear Creek, the example from my valley. And that's usually because we've straightened it or what have you, but that would happen naturally in some systems too. If something catastrophic happened and you get this channelization, and well, then that's an especially fire prone situation because beavers can't maintain that. And you do get a fire that's a stand replacing fire. Well, stand replacing fires, then you have a lot of accumulated woody debris that starts crashing down in that stream. And your velocity barrier is suddenly not such a thing anymore because you've got all this roughness and tangled burned wood that starts catching the sediment that comes off the fire because sediment's moving once a fire landscape gets rained on. Fires are a reset for a system that beavers are hard to utilize. And suddenly you've got something where every single one of the hardwoods is bouncing back with fresh new shoots. You've gotten rid of the conifer layer that beavers don't really find palatable anyway, and all those are racked up in the stream. And you've hit reset, and now it's ready for beavers. The tragic thing is, of course, then what we usually do is we go clean out every single stick that falls in the creek because we're worried about flooding implications, and so it only makes it worse.
Oh my goodness!
But the intelligence of the system being what fires could be a good thing for beaver too, in that they prep a habitat that's inaccessible to be more accessible again.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that concept of reset, and it is a kind of a hopeful one, right? Even a place that isn't beaver hospitable because the velocity of the water is too high can, as a natural process, can find itself within range of beaver architecture. That's cool.
We don't have to wait for wildfire. We could go stick sticks in the creek.
Well, let me ask you this.
And people do.
Yeah, you could encourage the beavers in that way, and presumably, my guess would be that the beavers actually detect the reset, that the consequences of fire might cause beavers to go into explorer mode, because it may be possible that some piece of habitat that wasn't useful is now useful, but presumably they are in explorer mode enough just by virtue of producing offspring.
Yeah, and it actually seems like the adults themselves go into explorer mode every summer. So there's accounts dating back 150 years of naturalist snow dacing that, like where did the beavers go in July and August? And it does appear that beavers will go assess the surrounding landscape and check in, and then they come back and they keep investing, or they don't, So one of the things we see happen on the landscape sometimes is like, there's a nearby colony and it gets trapped off and it's in better habitat than this other colony. Well, they go into explorer mode that summer, they find out, hey, those digs are open.
Yeah.
And then they jump ship on this one and they move downstream. So what happens then in the context of some human who is having a disagreement with beaver at their driveway culvert, the pipe where the water is supposed to go through, and beavers plug it, and they're like, haha, that human left one hole in a perfectly good dam.
Right.
And
oh, goodness.
now I've identified that. I fixed the issue. We now have flooding. So people get on this treadmill of trapping beavers.
And they get replaced by...
And they get replaced by other beavers in the landscape who have identified, no, that's the better habitat. And so you have a population sink. You have a black hole.
All right.
Right? So you can have just one person who's
one
just
person
kind of struggling.
trapping out beavers, depleting land that they are not actually trying to keep beavers out of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but because that was the preferred habitat, then you're going to see depletion. And probably because of that explorer mode...
Yeah.
And we've seen this where, a whole little sub watershed will be full of beavers, and then some land ownership will change, and the new landowner is intolerant, and they happen to be at the best beaver habitat. And over the course of the year, or 2 or 5, they trap a lot of beavers, and suddenly there's no other beavers around.
Wow. Oh, that's such a terrible story.
Yeah, I mean, it's also encouraging, I guess, in that usually folks don't want to be trapping beavers, and they're on that treadmill, and it's frustrating for them too. So kind of helping folks think through, can the monkeys outsmart the rodents? Generally you can't, or the fish outsmart the fish. It's,
right.
It doesn't quite have the same rate.
No, it's confusing.
But the promise in doing that is, like, if you can identify those population sinks, if you can identify those black holes where folks are struggling, and it's just a pest species, whatever, it can have profound impacts on the entire square miles of.
Are you talking about by getting them to rethink getting rid of the beavers? Or it seems to me that if you could, it's a weird thing to advocate for, but if they're going to be a black hole for beavers through this process, getting them to reduce the quality of that habitat that they're trying to keep beavers out of so that other beavers don't adopt it would also have that effect.
It would, yeah. It would be probably very illegal in most areas.
Really?
Yeah, because our wetlands are so well protected legally that you can't purposely degrade a wetland. And that's part of the fear that people feel when a beaver shows up. It's like, now I'm going to have this animal that's going to encumber my property with additional regulation.
Right.
Quick off it before it starts doing stuff.
Yep. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah. But yes, that's true. If your property was in a degraded state, in comparison to other adjacent properties, then you could predict the beavers are going to occupy the next best available habitat. And what we often see is if you have too many population sinks, then beavers, the only beavers you see are the ones that are living on rivers, because life is peachy on a river, man. You can have a bank den.
Right.
You've got all the willow you could ever eat. The water's deep. No need to build a dam.
Yeah.
Right. And as long as there's always room, they never hit carrying capacity, right? Like, not all the spots are filled on the river, then no juvenile's ever going to have to go make a living higher up in a stream where you got to build a dam, and life is more work and water is scarce. And so that, people will say, well, we have enough beavers. They're in all these systems, but we're living in I've heard the term like functionally extirpated, right?
Yeah.
And that, yes, there's beavers, but functionally,
right,
they're no longer a verb.
So my guess, based on what you've said, is that the river beavers are present, but they're not as valuable, that the work that they do is not in a position to have this fire suppressive or
right. They're not managing water.
Yeah, they're not.
They're cycling nutrients still, sure. Yeah. But we selfishly as people looking at this, we need it to be at the point where the river's so chock-a-block full of beavers that the young ones are forced to go up and do real work.
Do some work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting and quite sad, really. It's interesting that it's the same animal that can do this on a river and managing upland habitat.
Yeah, well, and that's cool too, right? Because you can take a river beaver and go stick it upland, and it's like, damn it, it does exactly that.
It does a thing, which actually makes sense if you think about it, because you probably have a a population level phenomenon where the rivers are the thing that links all of these disjointed upland habitats. And so, it'd be really interesting to know, maybe you do know, what the relationship is between the river populations and all of these little tributaries in the hills.
Yeah, no, I don't. There's been some genetic studies done, and basically it says, beavers are more related in watersheds than they are in the next watershed over, but it didn't really tell.
That's not surprising.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Is anything known about how many generations a particular, a large dam and lodge represent? How long a particular lineage of beavers will manage a particular piece of habitat?
Well, it's kind of like the big whales, right? We went, killed them all, and then we're looking back at historical records and we're like, that whale was way bigger than anything we see now. How old was it?
Right.
We have no idea, It's that bowhead whale that they found a 200-year-old stone point in.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, well, we know they get to 200.
Yep.
Right? We're in a similar position with beaver because where are the places that we didn't go trap out beavers and bust beaver dams? There's one spot in the boreal forest where there's a beaver dam you can see from space. It's clearly been there a long time.
Wow.
And it's shifted so much of the landscape that it's a spot you can identify. But yeah, the life cycle of a beaver dam in a place where there's a lot of sedimentation, right, where the water turns murky in the winter, is that will accumulate behind the beaver dam, and eventually you'll get a meadow.
Yep.
Back to it being flat because of beaver dams.
Yep.
Right? But the water has to go somewhere, so it'll be threaded through, or maybe it'll be over on this side now more than that side, and beavers will be building additional dams. And so it's this process of uplift, right? And
creating land.
Creating land.
Yeah.
And so, those cycles are iterative where you'll have, ghosts of beaver kingdoms, buried underneath the new meadows that have been formed more recently, right? It's so a beaver dam that exists for a really long time as one dam, I would predict that there's not a lot of sediment coming in, I guess, is where you'd have
because
to go.
Otherwise it would have
turned
into a meadow.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
there's no reason these things didn't last a really long time, hundreds of years, right, or more. And
again, it's going to be compromised by the fact that we're looking at modern stuff, and we don't necessarily know what the pre-Columbian or maybe even pre-human situation was.
Yeah, and a beaver dam that's old, even 20 years old, you can't tell it's a beaver dam.
Right.
I mean, that's the great thing.
Yeah, that's
right. The classic lattice work of sticks, that only lasts for 2 or 3 years, and then it looks like a landscape.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're funny. You have to identify them by the fact that the water is behaving in a way
differently.
You wouldn't expect it to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, what is the largest beaver body of water that is known?
Oh, I don't know. It's a good question, and because you can measure that 2 ways, like tallest beaver dam.
Right.
And you could measure laterally out. Beavers, when they so say you've got an incised system, right? Incised meaning that the creek has collapsed into this trench.
Yeah.
And beavers successfully build a dam there. At first, it kind of looks like the Hoover Dam in a sense. I mean, it's just this plug, right? But then quickly, if they get out on the valley floor, they start chasing the water with a really usually pretty low dam initially.
Yeah.
And they are remarkably adept at more or less tracing the topography lines. So if you look at a beaver dam from above, and then you were to overlay a topo line map at sufficient detail, that dam, every decision that they made in making that would overlay well with topography.
Well, it makes sense because water is self-leveling.
Exactly. So all you have to do is make a decision the next inch over.
Right.
Right. And so then they'll chase that usually to the valley edges, and then those things start going up, and then some of that blows out, but then they catch it down lower. And so it's back to it being a process, right? Like the dam itself, very quickly, if this process is working, you can't point to and say, this is the dam. In a simplified system, it's really easy to say, well, that's the primary dam. That's the dam that they use to back up water over their denning situation. These are auxiliary dams. These are just facilitating habitat, right?
Yeah.
But then as soon as it actually really starts working, it's all kind of unclear.
Well, I feel better now that I didn't spot that wetland near Evergreen was a beaver
suggests
pond for a
that
while.
it's more mature and developed.
Yeah, it was definitely a long-standing spot. Pretty nifty.